Hey there folks, and welcome to another dive down the MIDI rabbit hole. Today I'm taking a look at MIDI connections and cables, looking at MIDI in, out, through and soft through. I've made numerous MIDI videos receiving hundreds of thousands of views and have helped many people with their MIDI setups. So stick around and you may find this one useful too. And as ever, any questions, please leave them in the comments and I will get back to you. So to start with, when looking at connecting gear via MIDI, you need to know what MIDI ports you have available on your gear. Does it have a MIDI in? Does it have a MIDI out? Does it have a MIDI through? And if it doesn't have a MIDI through, does it have a soft through? Now I've done separate videos covering things like MIDI through and soft through in great detail, and so won't go too more in depth on those today, but just as a brief recap, a MIDI in port is where a synth receives data from another piece of gear. A MIDI out port is where a synth sends its data to another piece of gear. But always remember, only MIDI data that originates from that synth itself will be sent via the MIDI out. A MIDI through port takes a copy of what is received at the in port and sends it out to another piece of gear. This means that the synth can send data that did not originate from it, but which originated from another source, meaning it acts like a sort of middleman or go-between if you like. A soft through is a software-enabled function that allows a MIDI out port to function as a through port, and in most cases as an out and a through at the same time, either enabled in the utility or system settings or via a dedicated software editor. In addition to knowing what MIDI ports you have and what they do, you also need to understand how MIDI cables work. The most important thing to remember is that they are unidirectional, i.e. they can only send data in one direction. The standard cable is a 5-pin DIN MIDI cable, as shown here, which is designed to plug into standard MIDI ports on your gear, like these. Each end of a MIDI cable is identical, so it doesn't matter which way round you plug the cable in, the same as any standard audio cable. You may also come across TRS MIDI cables. These are basically the same as 3.5mm TRS audio cables and are used when the MIDI ports on your device are the mini port variety, usually employed on smaller desktop devices where there isn't enough room for full-size DIN ports. For example, the Korg Volca series, as shown here. And you can also get TRS to 5-pin DIN MIDI cables, so you can connect gear with mini MIDI ports to gear with full-size MIDI ports. If you are confronted with these mini TRS MIDI ports, it's important to be aware there are two types, Type A and Type B, and they are not cross-compatible, so you'll need to check which type the manufacturer of your synth uses and use the correct one. If you're connecting a Type A to a Type B, you'll need what is called a crossover cable, which converts the signals appropriately. Remember though, this only applies to TRS MIDI. With standard 5-pin MIDI, there's no such complications. Now, back to our MIDI connections. The signal will always flow from an out or a through port as they send data, and will always go to an in port as they receive data. If you want a device to communicate in both directions, for example, you want it to send data somewhere, but also want to be able to receive data back from somewhere, you'll need two MIDI cables, and you must have both the MIDI in and out ports connected by separate cables so that you can both send and receive data. It's worth noting here that TRS MIDI cables are in fact bidirectional, unlike 5-pin MIDI cables, and can send data in both directions on a single cable. However, in general, they're used in a unidirectional manner similar to 5-pin MIDI cables. Also, as an aside, if you're using MIDI over USB, then you only need one cable, as USB cables are also bidirectional, sending and receiving from a single port. In general, the The USB port on the synth will be a type B and the port on the computer will be a type A, or more commonly these days, possibly a type C. But I digress. We're talking about MIDI ports today and good old-fashioned 5-pin DIN MIDI cables. By identifying which MIDI ports each of your synths have, this can help greatly in understanding how the MIDI signals will flow once you start connecting things. For info, in the following examples, things like setting MIDI channels or the use of MIDI clock to synchronize everything aren't being covered, as I cover those in the dedicated videos that I have on those topics. Here I'm just looking at the basic MIDI connections. For example, let's take this simple scenario. We have 3 synths, A, B and C, and for example we want A to be able to play itself, but also to act as a master controller and be able to play B and C. If we connect the MIDI out of A to the MIDI in of B, then A can play B. But what if we connect the out of B to the in of C? Well, this means that B can play C and A can still play B. However, A can't play C as its signal terminates at B. This is because we're using the out port from B to synth C, and therefore the only thing synth C is receiving are MIDI signals that originate from synth B. The signal from synth A cannot reach synth C. If synth B has a through port though, and we use that to connect B to C, now the signal from A goes into B, but a copy of that signal is also passed to the through port and on to C, which means A can now play C while still being able to play B. However, B will no longer be able to play C as its own signal is now not being sent via the out, as we are instead using a through port and only sending a copy of the signal received at the in port on synth B, not any signal that originates in synth B itself. Now, if B didn't have a through port, then this wouldn't be possible, unless B had a soft through, which is becoming more prevalent on modern synths. With a soft through, we would connect the out from B to the in of C, but with soft through enabled, the out will now act as a through. In fact, it's acting as both an out and a through at the same time, which can offer some advantages which I cover in more detail in my dedicated soft through video. Now the signal from A is copied to the out port of B, which is acting as a through, and travels on to synth C. But also the signal from B itself is now also being sent from the out port to synth C. So we actually have 2 signals being sent simultaneously from one MIDI out port. In this case, what it means is that A can play B, and it can also play C as its signal is being passed through synth B. But now B can also play C, which wasn't possible previously, and only possible if the synth has soft through capability. So as you can see, depending on whether you have in, out, through or soft through available, it has quite an impact on how you can connect your gear and how they can interact with one another. And just as a quick recap, with only MIDI in and MIDI out available, A can play B and B can play C. No matter how many synths you connect together, each one can only be played by the one before it in the chain. If a through port is available, then A can play B, but can also have its signal passed on to C, but B can now no longer play C. And if a soft through is available, then A can play B and C, same as if we were using a through port, and B can also play C as if we were using an out port. The key thing to remember when planning out your MIDI routing is that if your synth only has a MIDI out port and not a MIDI through port, then any signals coming into it via its MIDI in will terminate at that synth. They can't travel any further. But if you have a through port, those signals can continue on their journey to other gear. But remember, the through port is only sending copies of what it receives at the MIDI in. It's not sending any data that originates on the synth itself, unless of course you have a soft through available, and then it can. What this means is there are limitations on how you can connect your synths depending on what MIDI ports you have available. Some only have a MIDI in, some have a MIDI in and a MIDI out. Some have a MIDI in, an out and a through. Others might have a MIDI in and 2 MIDI outs, one of which can operate as a through. And some, although having a MIDI in and a MIDI out, will have a soft through available so that the out port can act as a through and an out at the same time. There are other combinations of MIDI ports, but these are some of the most common that you'll find. There are, though, ways to overcome these limitations through the use of peripheral devices such as THRU boxes, MERGE boxes, or MIDI interfaces. For example, let's take our ABC scenario again. If all 3 synths only had ins and outs, then we know that we can't get A to talk to both B and C. But this is where a through box would come in. By connecting A to a through box, we can now connect that through box to both B and C. And now A can talk to both of them. What though if we not only wanted A to control B and C, but we also wanted B to be able to control C? Well, that's where a merge box could come in. Here we would connect A to the through box as before, but then connect one of the outs from the through box to synth B and the other to the merge box. We would then connect the out from B to the merge box and connect the out from the merge box to synth C. This now means that the signal from A not only goes into the through box and onto synth B, but also onto the merge box and into synth C, while at the same time the signal from B goes to the merge box where it is merged with the signal from A, and both of them go to synth C. So now A can play B and C, but B can also play C. But as you can see, things start to grow ever more complicated. What if we wanted B and C to be able to play A? Well, again, a merge box would help here. We could take the MIDI outs from B and C and run them into the merge box, and then connect the merge box back to synth A. This means that A can still talk to B and C via the through box, but B and C can also talk to A via the merge box. This, however, would be at the loss of the connection between B and C, so again we meet some limitations. Which brings us neatly onto our next solution, a MIDI interface, such as the Conductive Labs MRCC that we can see here on the screen, but there are many other different types available. This all-in-one box replaces the need for separate through and merge boxes and replaces them with a single unit. Now all we would do is connect the MIDI in and out from each synth to the interface and then program the interface as to how we want the signals to flow. So again, let's take our ABC scenario. We plug the MIDI out from each synth to the MIDI ins on the interface, and then plug the corresponding MIDI out on the interface back to the MIDI in on each synth. This means that everything can now talk to the MIDI interface and everything can receive data back from the interface, allowing you to pass signals through or merge them and pretty much do whatever you want. Then in the interface we would program it so that synth A MIDI out goes to the MIDI ins of synths B and C, synth B MIDI out goes to the MIDI ins of synths A and C, and synth C MIDI out goes to the MIDI ins of synths A and B. Now everything can talk to everything else without the need for any through or merge boxes. These MIDI interfaces, though, can be very costly, and dependent on the complexity of your setup, they may well very much be a nice to have rather than a necessity. There is, of course, also one other solution if you're always using a computer. and that is to forego all the MIDI cables, merge boxes, through boxes, etc., and just route everything through your DAW. Using Cubase as an example here, you'll find in your DAW a routing option, with other DAWs having similar functionality. Once you've set up a MIDI track for an instrument, you can determine the MIDI input, i.e. what piece of gear the MIDI signal is coming from, and you can assign multiple pieces of gear as the input or just one single piece of kit. You can set the MIDI channel that the input is being sent on, determine the piece of gear that you want the signal to be sent to, and what MIDI channel you want that signal sent on. If all your synths and gear have USB, then the DAW route is a perfectly viable option. Just connect them all to your computer through a powered USB hub and then route everything in the DAW. However, if you have older synths without USB, then you will need a MIDI interface in order for them to communicate with your computer. In addition, ditching the MIDI cables and going the DAW route would mean that for everything to work, be in sync, be able to play each other, etc., you would always need to have the computer turned on. Not a problem per se in many home studios, but some people like to work DAW-less without a computer, and others, like myself, want to be able to do both, which is why I have a hybrid setup with everything connected and routed via MIDI cables, but all that routing also mirrored in my DAW with everything connected to the computer via USB cables, meaning I can have the best of both worlds. Well, I hope that was useful for you. Just remember, when looking at connecting your gear, make a note of exactly what MIDI capabilities each piece of gear has. Does it have an in, an out, a through, or a soft through? And then you should be in a great position to work out how to get the MIDI signals to flow around your studio to achieve the things that you want. I'll leave a link below to my MIDI playlist, which has a whole host of videos covering the topics touched on here today, but in much more detail, with videos on through, soft through and merge, as well as other topics like MIDI channels, CCs and MIDI clock, to name but a few. So that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful, and if you have, please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell, as it really is appreciated. And it helps me to grow the channel and reach a wider audience so I can help more people. And if you've got any questions on this or any of my other content, then please leave them in the comments down below and I will get back to you. Indeed, any other feedback is of course gratefully received. But for now, I've been Graham. Take care and catch you later.